and really, look forward to hearing your conversation about moving to a world beyond p less than 0.05.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, folks, for joining. I'm so regret that I can't be there with you. I had very much looked forward to that, but for obvious reasons, lots of things have changed. On the other hand, I see several people on this webinar that wouldn't have been able to join had we been holding it locally, and so that's great. So we're having our natural disasters at the moment, of course, but in your part of the world, in the Northeast, in almost 30 years ago, another natural disaster of a very different kind took place. It was the convergence of three weather systems, a cold front, as I understand it, a high pressure system, and what was left of Hurricane Grace. These elements converge to create what has become known as the perfect storm, a name made famous by Sebastian Junger's book, and then a movie in 2000 starring George Clooney. Well, we have a confluence of events going on right now as well. It's been a long day already for many of you. You're watching this webinar from the comfort of your home where you may be, really super relaxed. I'm your speaker. And so this all has the ingredients for the perfect nap, pre-social distancing, obviously. If that's the case, no one's going to know. If you don't have your camera on, have a good rest and join us whenever you feel like it. If you are a parent, or if you have parents, then you know what the talk is. It's that moment when you need to explain to young ones the mysteries of human procreation, the birds and the bees. Now, I have no idea why it's called the birds and the bees, since neither birds nor bees procreate the way that humans do, but that's the metaphor, and it's not mine to mess with. In 2010, my wife and I brought home two boys from Haiti, and they spoke no English, and we certainly spoke no Haitian Creole. And that was in the spring, and in late summer, I was sitting down in the basement, minding my own business, watching a Washington Nationals baseball game, the world champion Washington Nationals, I should be sure to say. And my wife came downstairs with the boys. She had a look in her eye, and apparently something had gone on upstairs, which signaled to her that it was time for me to have the talk with the boys. Now, again, the talk is hard enough, confusing enough, but when there's a language barrier, it's even more so. Now, hopefully I've gone on about this long enough so that you're wondering why I'm bringing it up. Well, I've had the wonderful opportunity for the last 4 years plus to talk to lots of groups about p-values, and in particular, lots of non-statistical groups about p-values. And I've discovered that having that conversation is very much like having the talk with a couple of pre-teenagers. And let me see if I can show you the similarities. For example, they think they know about it already because they've learned about it from their peers. It wasn't nearly as interesting a conversation as they thought it would be. They stopped listening long before I stopped talking, and if I'm going to be very honest about the whole thing, they probably understood it even less after I was done. So that's just fair warning that that's what could happen today during this webinar. Now, I don't know about your background. Some of you have a lot of statistics background, some of you maybe less. So I've put together a very carefully developed, tested, one-item test to let you know whether you're prepared to understand the remainder of this presentation. If you're able to pass this one-item test, then you should be good to go the rest of it. So here we go. If this chart is understandable to you, then you should have no problems with the rest of the presentation. And I haven't seen anybody drop off, so I think that we're good to go. Let's get on the same page about what a p-value is. In the ASA 2016 statement on p-values and statistical significance, something I'll say more about in a few minutes, we offered an informal definition that looked like this. Informally, a p-value is the probability under a specified statistical model that a statistical summary of the data, that might be, for example, the comparison between two sample means, would be equal to or more extreme than its observed value. We thought that was pretty straightforward, but the press didn't agree. Christy Ashwanden, who was then the lead writer for Science at 538, said that the definition was about as clear as mud. Okay, so we maybe didn't accomplish what we wanted to accomplish. I guess we could have gone this way. Now, there may be a couple of you on the call for whom this definition is quite appropriate, but for the rest of us, it may be a little dense to go through. So instead of trying to define a p-value, let me just walk through with you how we go about computing p-values. So we start off with some information that we have, some research that we know. We know some things. And we're inquisitive people by nature. We'd like to know more. And so one of the ways of doing that is to design an experiment to help us go from where we are to increase our knowledge in some way. So then we collect data from that experiment. And then typically we would numerically summarize the results of that experiment in some way. And then ask ourselves, now what do we know? We've gone through these steps. Now what have we learned, and where do we go next? So I want to focus in on that numerical summarizing of the data. We summarize data into a number that we call a statistic, and from that statistic we compute a probability, and that's the p-value. Probability is the p in p-value. If the p-value is small enough, we call that statistically significant, and typically 0.05 has been the threshold. Smaller than 0.05, and then we would call it statistically significant. So let me illustrate with a straightforward example. This comes from PLOS Medicine, Public Library of Science Medicine. There's nothing special about this example. It's very easy for me to find an example because this is typically the kind of thing that's done. So in this particular research, a new treatment was being compared to a placebo to treat people with renal problems with their kidneys, and the little part of this research that we'll zoom in on here for a minute was measuring something called total kidney volume, about which I know very little, I'll be honest. But after a year, the difference in median total kidney volume, that is the difference between the measurements in the people who received the treatment, the people who received the placebo, was about 97 milliliters. And there's, for those of you who are into this sort of thing, there's the very wide 95% confidence interval associated with that estimate. And the p-value was computed to be 0.027, which we'll round off to 0.03 for purposes of our discussion in this presentation today. So let's ask ourselves, how do we get that number, that 0.03? Well, to compute the p-value, you have to assume quite a few things. The key assumption, the assumption that gets the most attention, is that we assume, to start off with, that there's going to be no difference between the treatment and the placebo. That is, the outcomes are going to be the same on average between those subjects that receive the treatment and those who received the placebo. So what does the p-value mean? Well, if there's no difference between the treatment and the placebo, that is, if what we assumed is true, if everything else that we assume besides that is also true, then the probability that we would have observed the difference that we found, that is 97 milliliters, or an even larger one, is 0.03. Now, I won't linger long over this because I could spend the whole time on it actually, but there are a number of common ways that 0.03 or the p-value is misinterpreted. And I won't unpack these. I'll just put them out there for you. And I'll just say that I'm going to show you 3, but there are, a couple of dozen of kind of common ways that the p-values can be misinterpreted or misstated. So one of them is that there's only a 3% chance that the placebo was better than the treatment. Another is that there's only a 3% chance of getting the result we did by chance alone. The probability the null hypothesis is false is 97%. I haven't really talked about null hypotheses here, and I won't in the interest of time. And like I said, there's a great many other misinterpretations as well. But I won't take the time to unpack those. Instead, I'm going to focus on what we can conclude. We might have had really bad luck in our sample selection, and if we picked different people, we'd have gotten different results, or one or more of our assumptions was wrong. Possibly, but not necessarily the assumption that the treatment was no better than the placebo. And it's important to recognize that the failure of any of the assumptions that we make can affect the p-value. So our p-value was p equals 0.03, and this is why Nick wanted me to dial all the way in from Washington, D.C., so you could get this high level of expertise that I'm about to provide for you right now, that 0.03 is smaller than 0.05. You're welcome. And so we call that statistically significant. R.A. Fisher, the preeminent statistician of the first half of the 20th century, certainly a giant in statistics, called such results significant or statistically significant. And if there was such a thing as an undo button back then, that would have been what he probably would have pressed it for. If he could take something back, that would probably be what he'd take back, because to Fisher, significant meant that the result was worth further scrutiny, something that we should investigate more. But unfortunately, that concept didn't really stick, at least in part probably because the word significant means something very different than worth further scrutiny. And let me illustrate this to you in several ways. For example, let's talk about antonyms to significant. So insignificant, unimportant, meaningless. Those are terms that don't suggest by being opposites that the word just means that something is worth further scrutiny. Let's think about significant as an adjective. For example, a significant increase. We would like to have a significant increase in our paychecks. We would very much like to have a significant decrease in the instances of COVID-19. We talk about significant events, a wedding, a bar mitzvah, and so on. Those are significant things that happen in our lives. We even refer to special people in our lives as significant others. I mean, you would never say to someone, you know, you are almost becoming significant to me. That's just not something that is likely to be a good conversation starter. Now, let me illustrate this another way by focusing you in on this word, the word mole, and asking you to think about the first thing that comes into your mind when you thought about this word. Okay, so hold that thought. Maybe it was this creature that can tear up your backyard. Maybe it was a particularly well-placed spy. Might have been a skin irritation. Maybe because we're probably a nerdier crowd on average than usual, you may have thought of a unit of measurement as what stuck in your head for mole. But in any case, there's no way that in context, any of these meanings are going to be misunderstood. But many times when we use scientific words, they are used in other contexts as well, and so the words get misunderstood. And it reminds me of one of my very favorite movies. You'll recognize this as being from The Princess Bride, if that's also on your list of movies that you love. And if it is, you'll remember that Inigo was very distressed by Vicini because he kept saying something that clearly didn't mean what he thought it meant. And if you know the movie, you know that what he said was inconceivable. And he kept saying inconceivable right after something happened. So something would happen, inconceivable, and something else would happen, inconceivable. And clearly, these things weren't inconceivable because they just kept right on happening. Well, there's a wonderful article from Scientific American a few years ago that talks about 7 misused scientific words. Let me illustrate from the article. So one example is the word hypothesis. A hypothesis has a scientific meaning. It's a proposed explanation, but more than that, it's a proposed explanation that can be tested. There's a way to check out your hypothesis. I could say, and I might in common speech, I could use that word very differently than science does. For example, I could say, I have a hypothesis why your mother doesn't like me. Well, that's a hypothesis in common language, but it's really not a testable hypothesis. Theory is another such word. Theory has a scientific meaning. It's an explanation that has been substantiated through repeated experiments or testing. And so when you hear someone say, referring to science, that's just a theory, that is, well, that just doesn't make any sense. And word number 6 in these 7 misused scientific words is the word significant. Let me show you this one more way, and I'm going to do it through an example you probably didn't expect, and that is Tinder. Now, what you have to imagine with me is that you're going through Tinder looking for some research that you have some interest in. And you come across some research which has this attractive looking p-value that we got. It's under 0.05, it's 0.03. Now, if you're a Tinder user and you are interested in this particular p-value, then you know that your proper course of action is to swipe right. Well, swiping right in Tinder is analogous to what Fisher meant with his definition of significant or statistically significant. The idea is that the experimental results have some interest and that we should take some more time with them. We're not going to jump to any conclusions, but maybe it's worth dating this experiment, as it were. It does not mean what I'm about to show you, even though it has sort of come to mean that in the way science is often practiced. If this is what you misunderstood in Tinder, it would be a very bad Tinder date indeed. Now, I'm going to illustrate this a slightly different way. I'm going to show you some quotes from published research in which individuals had in their research, they got a p-value equal to or nearly equal to 0.06. That's obviously bigger than 0.05, and so they had to do some explanation. But before I start showing you these, let me introduce the concept of a bright line or a bright line rule, in case it's not something that's familiar to you. A bright line rule is a rule that allows someone, this is particularly a judicial or regulatory term, a legal or regulatory term, that allows someone to sort of always make a crystal clear decision about whether something is or it is not. So for example, the Miranda warning is a bright line rule. When a subject is arrested, a suspect is arrested, that person either was administered their Miranda rights or they weren't. And if they weren't, sort of case closed. Well, 0.05 is treated like that. It's treated like a bright line that you have to get across or else you didn't make it. And so here again are what some people had to write to try to explain their p-value that didn't quite make it across the line. So almost significant, almost attained significance, almost significant tendency, almost became significant. You can see kind of that aspirational thing going on with that p-value, almost but not quite significant, almost statistically significant, almost reach statistical significance, just barely below the level of significance, and just beyond significance. Just missed. Well, people who got p-values that are a little bigger, something like 0.08, they have even more explaining to do. So let's take a look at the kind of explanations that have been offered in the literature. A certain trend towards significance, a definite trend, a slight tendency towards significance, a strong trend towards significance. You can see kind of a trend developing in how people are trying to explain this. And let me ask you a question at this point. In your mind, how many numbers, how much data does it take to establish a trend? Now, I don't know you folks. I don't know the different kinds of backgrounds that you come from, your education, your gender, your race, your ethnicity, etc. But my guess is that regardless of where you came from, whatever your race, ethnicity, gender is, however you were educated, the number you picked for how much data you have to establish a trend is more than one. And yet people are trying to explain their p-values in terms of a trend. And so here we go again, a trend close to significance, an expected trend, that's even better. Approaching our criteria of significance, it's headed down the road, hopefully it'll get there. Approaching borderline significance, which sounds to me like a condition. Approaching, although not reaching significance. Now, one more set of examples. These are particularly painful because we got really close to 0.05, but didn't quite get over that bright line. So, hovered at a nearly significant level. Hovers on the brink of significance. Where my mind goes is little UFOs hovering over Area 51, but that's just the way I think. Just about significant? Yep. Just above the margin of significance, which is an interesting turn of the phrase. Just at the conventional level of significance, because somehow all 5 of those digits are significant in some way. Just barely statistically significant. Just borderline significant. There's that condition again. Just escaped significance. Oh my gosh, got out the door with that lab rat. And just failed significance. Many thanks to Matthew Hankins for collecting these. There are literally hundreds of these at his website, and these slides will be available to you so you can get this link. Now, I'm going to switch gears a little bit from the issues with the way the word significant is used to talk about sort of another problem with the use and interpretation of p-values. And that is that generally, what we would like to be able to do is to conclude something about our hypothesis based on the data that we have. Remember that informal walkthrough that I did where we said we'd know some stuff, and now we'd like to know some more stuff. And so we'd like to be able to conclude, take our data and conclude something about the hypothesis. So a way of framing that statistically is asking, what is the probability that our hypothesis is true based on the data that we have observed? And we can write that in statistics in this format, in this mathematical format, the probability of H given D. Unfortunately, a p-value statement is a probability about our data assuming the hypothesis. That is, rather than P of H given D, it is the probability of D given H. And these two things are not equal except under very extraordinary circumstances. Let me illustrate that with a little bit of a macabre illustration, but one that'll stick. We'll use the same letters, but we'll ask ourselves, what is the probability that a person is dead given that the person was hanged? And so we could write that as a P of D given H. Now, I don't have any data on that, and I'm pretty sure I can't get my IRB to approve an experiment for this. So I'm just making up a number, and I'm just going to make up that 2% of people survive a hanging. And so the probability of D given H, it would be 98% under that very big assumption. Now let's reverse that and ask ourselves, what's the probability that a person has been hanged given that the person is dead? You're a detective, you walk into the room where you've been called because there's a dead body, and the first question you ask yourself, of course, as any good detective would, is what's the probability that that person was hanged? It is, what is the probability of H given D? Okay, maybe that isn't what a good detective would do, and I don't have any better data than I did on the other way around, but I'm just making one up, that one death in 10,000 is by hanging, and so that makes a probability of 0.0001. As Ron Carver pointed out when he created this example 40 plus years ago, no one would be likely to make the mistake of substituting the first estimate for the second one. And yet, even though that's the case, this is what happens with p-values. That calculated estimates of the p-value, probability of D given H, are interpreted as though they were estimates of the probability of H given D, when they are clearly not the same. Switching gears again, I want to circle back to what I referenced earlier, the ASA's 2016 statement on p-values and statistical significance, and just say a little bit about why we decided as an association to issue such a statement, because it isn't something that we typically do. We do make statements on various kinds of policy things or certain very specific areas of statistical practice, but not on something as sweeping and fundamental as statistical significance and p-values, because typically the way we do those sorts of things or settle those sorts of things is through debate in the scientific literature. So let me read a quote to you. It has been widely felt, probably for 30 years or more, that significance tests are overemphasized and often misused, and that more emphasis should be put on estimation and prediction. Who said that? None other than one of the most famous statisticians of our time, D.R. Cox, or David Cox, and he wrote that in 1986, which then, if you do the math, that tracks back to at least 1956, and I will own up that that's the year of my birth. So yeah, you can do the math, or you can just know that I was born 2 to the 6th years ago, and this debate has been going on my entire lifetime. And you can find many more quotes like this at David Parkhurst's website. So this is something that's been debated for a long time. And in the article that leads into the ASA statement on p-values, Nicole Lazar and I wrote that there was nothing new here, that statisticians and others have been sounding the alarm for decades. But nothing was changing. And in fact, things were getting worse. And that's what prompted us to take some action. So for illustration of things getting worse, I'll just point to a couple of them. There were a great many things. One was this article in Science News, Odds Are It's Wrong, Science Fails to Face the Shortcomings of Statistics. In that article, all of statistics is thrown under the bus because some people are misinterpreting p-values. And in fact, in the lead-in, the opening paragraph to this article, Siegfried refers to statistics as, and I quote, a mutant form of math. That didn't make me very happy. Not too long after we got started on working on this statement, a social science journal, the Basic and Applied Social Psychology, actually banned the use of p-values at all in its journal. So that led us to work over an extended period of time to develop that ASA statement. What's the impact of that statement? Well, we could look at some metrics here. For example, the statement has been downloaded almost 400,000 times. That seems like a lot for a statistics paper. It's been cited over 2,700 times. So that also seems like a lot. But as a statistician, I'm duty bound to provide some basis of comparison for whether 400,000 downloads, 2,700 citations is a thing, or maybe there's just lots of statistics papers that are like that. So one reasonable thing to do would be to compare it with another paper that I wrote. So here's an example of another Wasserstein paper, and you can see that maybe it hasn't been read or cited quite as many times. I think many of those 17 views were by my mom. 400,000 seems like a lot, but it's pretty small compared to 2.8 billion views of Taylor Swift's Shake It Off video, or the 15 million views of John Oliver's wonderful Last Week Tonight piece on scientific studies, which, if you haven't seen, even though it's 3 years old, it's still very much worth seeing. It's very spot on. It's loaded with the F-bomb, but it's still very much worth looking at, and we'll actually take a look at an example from that segment a little bit later on. So in any case, with those comparisons in mind, it does seem like the ASA statement has had some reach, and I'm going to focus in on that statement a little bit. It consists of 6 principles, succinctly stated principles, and for the purposes of this talk, just focusing in on this one, that scientific conclusions and business or policy decisions should not be based only on whether a p-value passes a specific threshold. Other principles include things like things about proper use of p-values, things about the importance of transparency in reporting, and so on. Stating that principle a little more plainly, we argue that bright line thinking is bad for science. That is, remember that bright line thinking is the idea that you can make a choice in science based on whether something does or does not get over a certain specified threshold or finish line. Ken Rothman wrote this in a supplement to the 2016 ASA statement. He said, "Scientists have embraced and even avidly pursued meaningless differences solely because they are statistically significant and have ignored important effects because they failed to pass the screen of statistical significance." He goes on to say, "It's a safe bet that people have suffered or died because scientists and editors, regulators, journalists, and others have used significance tests to interpret results and have consequently failed to identify," and it looks like my screen got cut off here, the best courses of action. So I will be able to illustrate Rothman's point with a specific, very current example here very shortly. So we argue that it is time to move on, that it's time to say farewell to statistically significant. These arguments are presented in a couple of papers, one that I wrote with Nicole and Alan Sherm on moving to a world beyond p less than 0.05, and an article that appeared in Nature, Scientists Rise Up Against Statistical Significance. And why did we write those articles? Well, as I've shown you briefly during this talk, significance has lost its meaning. I've also illustrated to you in a couple of ways that bright lines lead to kind of bizarre behavior. You saw through that one quote, but many other things are possible, that decades of complaining have done nothing. In fact, in one of the 43 articles in the special issue of the American Statistician that editorial is in from about this time last year, Ray Hubbard and colleagues show that, in fact, over time, the problems have actually gotten worse. We say in this editorial that a label of statistical significance adds nothing to what is already conveyed by the value of p, and that, in fact, the dichotomization of p-values makes matters worse, And I'll point out one more thing. There are more things on the list, but one more thing is the something called the file drawer effect. And broadly speaking, the file drawer effect, a term coined by Rosenthal in the late 70s, is the notion that we publish the research that gets statistically significant results, and we don't publish the research that does not. Now, that leads to some problems. One of the problems is that maybe some really good ideas get left out. Maybe people end up repeating research that somebody else has done because of unpublished research. But as Rosenthal points out, at the extreme, the file drawer problem works like this. You imagine, say, 100 studies of kidney medicines that don't work, they're no different than the placebo, okay? 100 studies of kidney medicines that don't work. Using a 0.05 threshold, on average, 5 of those 100 studies will suggest that it does work, and the other 95 will say that it doesn't. And so the 5 studies that show that it did work get published, the other 95 don't get published, and now the error rate in the literature is not 5%, but it's actually 100%. All of those 5 articles were wrong. Now, let me be really clear here before I go into some illustrations of why these things are important. We're not advocating getting rid of p-values. P-values are important. And the we I'm talking about here is not the American Statistical Association. I'm talking about the authors of this editorial, myself, Nicole, and Alan, plus other authors in the special issue of the American Statistician. So it's important to make a distinction. The 2016 ASA statement is a statement of the association. That is speaking for the ASA. The stuff I'm talking about here is scientists, statisticians talking to each other in journals and expressing their scientific judgment. It's a publication of the ASA, but it's certainly not an official statement or an official position of the ASA. So that said, let me focus now on why this matters, why this isn't just academic talk. And I'm going to do that by a couple of trivial examples, and then I'm going to follow with a much more serious, relevant example. So let me start with power posing. Some of you may be familiar with power posing. It was quite the thing. It actually still is quite the thing in some circles. It was research that was done at Harvard, legitimate research that then became viral, essentially, in a TED Talk given by the researcher, and you can see that TED Talk has something like 55 million views. And the big idea in power posing was that if you would adopt some of these power poses for a short period of time, 2 of them for a minute each, that you can actually change your mindset and be better prepared to go into a meeting or a job interview. And so they did this research. They found statistically significant changes in testosterone and cortisol levels in people who used high power poses versus those who used low power poses. And they found that people who used the low power poses tended to be more risk averse. So just to give some clarity here, I wanted to show you what high power poses look like. And so you could adopt this pose for a bit before you go into your important meeting. Or one of these 2. The one on my right is my favorite because it has a name. It's the Wonder Woman pose, which I think is awesome. And here are 2 more high power poses. So there were 5 of those, and there were 5 low power poses too. They look like this. Here's a couple of low power poses. Not going to rev up your engines according to the study. A couple more low power poses. And this is supposed to be the lowest of the low power poses. Now, what went wrong with this study is that after it came out, other scientists, wanted to know if they could get the same kind of results, and the study didn't reproduce very well at all. In short, there was one of the problems was too much dependence on statistical significance. And I want to emphasize here that this wasn't, fraudulent research. This isn't anybody trying to pull anything over on anyone. It's just simply that human beings are difficult to measure. So there's a lot of noise in the data, and that can lead, especially in smaller samples, to significant results that don't reproduce very well. And so in one of the articles in the special issue of the American Statistician, McShane and colleagues remind us that especially when we get unexpected results, that we really should be thinking about other things, like what's the prior evidence for this? How plausible is this mechanism? How good is our study design? And so on, and not focus only on p-values or any other particular statistical measure. Should think about all those things. Remember, I said that p-values are subject to many assumptions. Well, at a JSM just a few years ago, the science writer Joe Palca pointed out that science goes in increments, but the media goes in leaps and bounds. And I want to illustrate that with this second example. This comes from that John Oliver presentation. And this is a headline that appeared on many, many news channels that said, glass of red wine equivalent to hour of gym time. Now, I don't know about you, but I would love that to be true. I was out for a 6-mile run today, and about halfway through, I'm going up a very steep hill, and a glass of red wine would have been simpler and easier and wouldn't have required a shower afterwards. But let's take a look at this research. So we back up to the actual research. Resveratrol may be a natural exercise performance enhancer. And we see that resveratrol is a natural compound found in some fruits, nuts, and red wine that may enhance exercise training and performance. Now let's get into the details a little farther. From the key point summary of the research, they said that resveratrol, an antioxidant found in red wine, has beneficial effects on cardiac and skeletal muscular function, similar to the effects of endurance exercise training, going on long runs, for example. But notice that it's not the red wine, it's antioxidant. It's found in red wine. Combining resveratrol supplementation with exercise training augments the beneficial effects of exercise alone. I'm sure you see the key words here, combining with exercise training. Yet that wasn't reported in any of the media things. We show that endurance capacity is enhanced in rats whose diet includes resveratrol during a 12-week endurance training program. In rats, there's no human connection here. And there were a couple of other things which I've highlighted in green. The green highlights are things that are directly related to using the 0.05 threshold. Now, if we look at the press release, the researcher said that his findings, his team's findings, would help those, he hoped, who were unable to exercise. So you could imagine someone who has, extreme diabetes or other things, and they're just not able to get to the gym or whatever. And their idea was that maybe we could give this to people and it would mimic exercise for them or improve the benefits of a lesser amount of exercise. And yet, none of those words appeared anywhere in the popular media. That's not what was reported out at all. So there are 5 words that you should greet whenever you see them with a healthy dose of skepticism. In a groundbreaking new study. Watch out for those words. As we wrote in our editorial, one study is rarely enough. The words a groundbreaking new study may be loved by news writers, but must be resisted by researchers. I mean, just think about a groundbreaking when you've seen like a new building on your campus. It's a few people dressed in suits with golden shovels in their hands, and they stick the spade in the ground and dig up a minor amount of dirt. And that action is a long way from ending up with a new campus building. And so breaking ground is only the first step in building a house. It will be suitable for habitation only after much hard work. By the way, for those of you who are nerdy about these things, like many of us on this Zoom call, this is the graphical version of this data on the rats. And the short version here is that they tended to pay a lot of attention to the bars that had asterisks indicating statistical significance, and practically no attention to how much difference there actually was between the heights of the bars themselves. Now, those were two examples that are not going to bring any major consequences to the world, but we're living in a very particular time, as you know, and here is a trial that was just recently conducted of a combination of two drugs for adults hospitalized with severe COVID-19. The study was given to patients who received these drugs, lopinavir, ritonavir, in addition to standard care, that's the treatment, or standard care alone, that's what the placebo is in this randomized trial. And you can see this is research that was published less than a month ago. And the research reported a mortality difference at 28 days of minus 5.8 percentage points, with a 95% confidence interval running from negative 17.3 to 5.7. Let's play that out a little bit more. What they wrote was that mortality at 28 days was similar in the treatment group to the placebo group. That is 19.2% versus 25%. Now, I'd like to quibble with 19.2 being similar to 25% on its face, but let's talk about the confidence interval and more. So they concluded that there's no benefit from this, but that's not necessarily what the results show. So we would argue that a better way of writing this would be something like this. Our estimate of the mortality difference at 28 days was minus 5.8 percentage points, that is 19.2% to 25%. So adding lopinavir ritonavir to standard care could result in a clinically large decrease in mortality. However, possible mortality differences that are highly compatible with our data, given our model, range from minus 17.3, which would be a very large decrease in mortality, to positive 5.7, which would be a large increase in mortality. Our trial was small, including only 199 patients, all with severe COVID-19. Further study of this potentially effective treatment is needed. And then we could go on to talk about how the result should be discussed in the context of the plausibility of the causal mechanism that would lead to a beneficial effect based on prior research. What manner of consistency is there among different study outcomes? If there have been other studies, what are the limitations of the studies? What are the adverse effects of this treatment? And any other relevant considerations. Now, that's not as simple to write down or to parse as it wasn't beneficial, but it's much more accurate about what the statistics are telling you. So how is it that we could make this change from using statistical significance to moving on to a world beyond p less than 0.05? Well, it won't be easy, and Goodman, in his paper in the 2019 The American Statistician, argues it this way. He says, the basic explanation is neither philosophical nor scientific, but sociologic. Everyone uses them. It's the same reason we can use money. When everyone believes in something's value, we can use it for real things, money for food, and p-value for knowledge claims, publications, funding, and promotion. It doesn't matter if the p-value doesn't mean what people think it means. It becomes valuable because of what it buys. But we're asking the question this way. In a world beyond p less than 0.05, what would you have to do to get your paper published, your research grant funded, your drug approved, your policy or business recommendation accepted? And if I had another hour to talk, I would give you some more direction in that regard, but you can look for those answers in the March 29 special issue of the American Statistician, which is online and open access. So to wrap up, we argue that it's time to stop using statistical significance as any kind of metric for scientific inference. My colleagues and I and many others have written a lot about what a world beyond p less than 0.05 should look like. P-values still have their uses. We don't want to overlook that point, and we want to make very clear that everything we've said highlights how important and vital statistics is. It's even significant, I would say, as ever. And it consistently is rated as one of the top jobs. Statisticians are needed now more than ever. So I thank you for this opportunity to present this to you. I would love to hear from you. You can tweet to me or email questions that we don't get to. I realize we only have a very short amount of time for questions, and I know that some questions are difficult in this format, but I'd be happy to answer questions offline as well. And so, Nick, I'm ready to take some questions.
That's great, Ron. And again, I want to give a kind of a virtual Zoom hand wave for you in terms of kind of a great talk, really valuable and very, very helpful. Matteo, you have a question. Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and say it? Or I think that's going to be feasible.
Sure, thank you. Hello, thank you. My name is Matteo Ondata. I'm a professor of computer science at Amherst. One of my favorite philosophers of science is someone who really doesn't agree with you. That's Deborah Mayo. And I also know that John Ioannidis really doesn't agree with you about this idea of getting completely rid of the dichotomy between significant and non-significant. I was wondering whether you could explain a little bit what the controversy is and what issues they are raising for the benefit of everybody here, and like how you reply to them.
So I probably don't have time to do a full-on reply to either John or Deborah in this context. Our disagreements, I do want to point out, are entirely professional. I not only highly respect those folks, but we've had some very nice conversations with one another, especially Deborah and me. Deborah argues that there is still a place for statistical significance from a philosophical point of view, and I don't feel like I can represent her ideas well, but they're interesting, and she has a great blog that's called Error Statistics that you should take a look at. I know you've taken a look at. I just meant the audience. John's arguments are in a JAMA editorial from 2019, in which I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but he worries that in the absence of statistical significance, it just kind of becomes, science research becomes the Wild West, and anybody can claim anything that they want. We disagree with that point, feel like that we open the floor for a more serious discussion of scientific research and don't just make statistical significance the be-all and end-all of determining or settling whether something has scientific merit or not. So, Matteo, that's a very short answer, and I'm happy to engage with you offline. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Nicole, I believe you have a question. You may need to unmute yourself.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Thanks for a great talk. I just jotted down a couple questions. They're all kind of centered around the same thing. You gave a great understanding for us about kind of where we are now in terms of the current understanding of how people obviously can extrapolate incorrectly from what a p-value is, and maybe how we might want to consider doing things otherwise in the future. If people like me or others were interested in learning more about, like, before Fisher had these ideas of, like, this is what significance is, like, how can we know what was stats like before that is kind of what I'm wondering. Like, is there a history of stats book? Hopefully it's not too dense, but I'm kind of wondering about that.
So that is, Nicole, a wonderful question, because it's really important to understand the context that Fisher was working in. In the 2019 special issue, the supplement of the American Statistician, which you can easily find on the website, and again, it's open access. One place that you can go for a nice history of that is an article by Lee Kennedy Schaefer. And I'm sorry I don't remember the title of that article, but what it does is it looks at the historical context in order to think about how we could move forward from where we are, which I think is the intention of your question. And in Lee's work, there are great citations for other articles if you want to learn more. So, for example, and we allude to this in the editorial that Alan, Nicole, and I wrote, that you can trace this back even 40 years before Fisher published his book that introduced this concept, to work by Edgeworth, where he actually talks about the kind of the concept of statistical significance without actually using it. And I think people have traced it back to, even farther than that. So you can get a great historical context for this from Lee Kennedy Schaefer's article, and his suggestions about what that implies for the 21st century. Thank you. Did you have a second question?
I think it was just a quick follow-up, which would be, that's actually really helpful. Thank you for telling me about that. This might sound silly, but almost like, what do you think the probability is, or like the proportion of people who kind of are in your camp among the scholars out there? Because this is kind of the first time I'm hearing about this, and I know I don't have that much stats exposure, but I'm curious if that's because people don't really talk about the whole, like, let's go beyond p-value thing, or if it's just that I have not been exposed to the discussion.
So I really have no data on that. It's a fair question, though. What I think I can report to you is that what's happening is what we hoped for, which is that there's a conversation. So, as in Mateo's question, people like Deborah and John push back. And in other quarters, there's other kinds of conversations. The New England Journal of Medicine rethought its requirements for statistical reporting in NEJM articles based on that, based on our editorial and these papers and so on. But they didn't go very far in the direction that we want, and we were urging. And you can see in the example that I gave earlier, which came from the New England Journal of Medicine, that we're reporting these things, but we're really still not thinking nearly hard enough about what our estimates mean. But at least they were reporting interval estimates, and not just we achieved statistical significance. So I would sum up by saying that I feel like there's a good discussion going on, that there's a lot of progress. I think it'll be a while before you might see some of it, because a lot of what you're going to see is books that were written before these discussions really took hold, starting back in 2016 with the ASA statement on p-values and statistical significance, but also because this approach of using 0.05 typically, although could be any other kind of threshold, as being a bright line, being a divider, is deeply ingrained in science and in scientific thinking, and anything like that requires time to change. It's a cultural change, and you know that cultures take time to change unless there's something extraordinary that happens that causes a major paradigm shift. And we don't have to look very far right now to see how that's happening in our lives, but that's not necessarily happening in research in a way that would speed along this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank
Great.
you.
One other kind of mention, Karen Kafadar noted that Steve Stigler's History of Statistics book, Nicole, is a wonderful resource for some of that earlier history. And I think that's just been really valuable. Ron, I wanted to thank you in terms of your leadership of the ASA, in terms of making those papers available from the 2019 special issue. I've been having my theoretical statistics students work through those papers and do lightning talks, picking up on the different viewpoints of them. And that's, to me, been a wonderful way for them to engage in these issues. Because as Nicole and others have said, you know, we don't have enough conversations about some of these issues. And there's kind of an orthodoxy to sometimes how they're put together. We've run out of time at this point, so I'm going to just go ahead and have one final virtual thanks to Ron. Thank you very much,
Nick.
Ron, for that. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording. But thank you.